Hello and welcome to today's Fragmentarium video conference. I am your host, William Debra, Project Manager of Fragmentarium. Now, however, it is my honor to introduce today's speakers, Dr. Jenmifer Bain of Dalhousie University, Director of the Digital Analysis of Chant Transmission Project, and Dr. Debra Lacoste of the University of Waterloo, and Director of the Cantus database. Drs. Bain and Lacoste will be speaking today on a study of two fragments from the binding of the Riesencodex. Dr. Lacoste.
Thank you. So on behalf of Jenmifer Bain and myself, I wish to thank the Fragmentarium team for the opportunity to present our project at this online workshop. Before we begin, we would like to acknowledge that Dalhousie University is located in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq, and that the University of Waterloo is situated on the traditional territory of the neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. Our active work toward reconciliation takes place across our campuses through research, learning, teaching, and community building, and is centralized within our Indigenous Initiatives Office. In the last couple of years, we have established the Digital Analysis of Chant Transmission Project that we are calling DACT for short. We want to bring together online medieval chant manuscript data with images, data repositories, bibliographies, legacy data sets, and any other relevant material that we can connect in a collaborative network. Our funding is through the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, and we were fortunate to receive server space through a competitive process on Compute Canada's national platform of advanced research computing resources. One of the primary objectives of the DACT project is to trace the movement of artifacts containing chant as they have traveled from medieval Europe around the world. The study and analysis of the artifacts themselves, as well as the chant contained in these fragmented leaves, may help us better understand the adaptation of chant repertories, will provide insights into missionary work during the period of colonization, and will supply a lens with which to view the social phenomenon, particularly in the 20th century, of acquiring ancient souvenirs. Collecting as much data as possible about chant manuscripts and fragments is key to analyzing their movements through time and place. Even more important for deeper analysis and comparison is knowing their complete contents, chant by chant. Using analytical software with inventories like those on the Cantus database is certain to uncover some of the mysteries surrounding loose fragments from chant books. And therefore, the Cantus database is an important partner within the research cluster of the DACT project. Many of you might already be familiar with the inventories of chant manuscripts on the Cantus database, many of which have links to digital image libraries like eCodices and Gallica. We have begun a partnership with Fragmentarium, where we have created inventories on the Cantus database with links to the Fragmentarium images and metadata. We have a partner page on the Fragmentarium site with a description of the DACT project, and we have adopted the Fragmentarium IDs into the Cantus database records. In addition to individual leaves on Fragmentarium, one of our main sources of fragments on the site has been the Paterbone collection from Trier. We have indexed over 70 of these fragments. Here is a sample inventory where you can see an outline of the contents of one of the fragments. And this is, if you have seen the Cantus database, then you know that this is a shortened view. We have incipits only, but there are full texts within each of the records. Folio, sequence on the side of the folio, the feast, the office, vespers, matins, the genre, antiphon, responsory, invitatory, etc. Another collection of fragments that is important to us because it is in a Canadian library is the set of leaves at McGill University in Montreal. There are over 40 fragments, and we are working with librarians to stream the images through Fragmentarium. With the spotlight now on the addition of fragment inventories to the Cantus database, we have developed several new protocols for data entry. During indexing, we have encountered a number of issues that are specific to chants on loose or damaged leaves. This is quite a long document, 10 pages worth or so of of instructions of how to deal with specific problems or issues that you might find. For instance, the text at the top of a page is often incomplete, beginning in the middle of a chant that was copied starting at the bottom of the previous page. One day, we hope to be able to match fragments and virtually reconstruct manuscripts, as has been done already with the Gottschalk Antiphonor and the Beauvais Missal. For an example of our text entry, this detached bifolium in the McGill collection has an incomplete chant at the top of its first side being this right-hand side of the image, just to the left of the uppercase blue A. This precedes the other side when it's folded. This is the detail page for the chant that you see in front of you, and this slide shows the chant with a little bit more detail and the Cantus database entry beside it. Since this chant is not complete from its start, it is entered as sequence 0 on this folio instead of 1. And you can see a lingua dolosa, the text, is entered as the only visible text there. The expected missing portion is in square brackets. That first part, that's what we expect would be on the bottom of the page before that we don't have. Having that missing text in square brackets may assist the search and connection of loose fragment leaves if we have enough data, and if we happen to have the data for adjacent leaves. We can imagine that the virtual connection of fragments would be even easier with metadata such as the size of the leaves, size of the principal writing space, number of staves per page, number of staff lines per stave, type of notation, type of script, and other such details. But besides collections of fragments in archives and the leaves posted on the Fragmentarium website, where else can we find fragments? It turns out that they are seemingly everywhere. I have one on my wall that I received as a gift from an elderly friend who picked it up in the 1950s in a Florence marketplace. It is now on Fragmentarium, by the way, and also indexed on the Cantus database. Chant manuscript fragments appear in online auctions, in antiquarian shops, in countless other places that the general public knows about. But we don't know about them. So we have begun a social media campaign to try to find them. Our Twitter feed is managed by one of our research assistants, Anna Debra, and she also collects information on fragments that are out there in the world through submissions via this Google form. Valuable information can be gleaned from detailed study of chant fragments, and it can be especially interesting when those fragments are part of the binding of another manuscript. And so I will now pass over the presentation to Dr. Jenmifer Bain for a case study on 2 fragments from the binding of the Riesencodex.
When liturgical books were used as binding materials, they were often very ordinary, previously regularly used books, but using a style of musical notation that had become obsolete or preserving older liturgy that had since been updated or reformed in some way. These ordinary books tell us more about daily monastic practice than the luxury books that are more likely to have survived into the modern era because of their decorative worth. They do pose significant challenges, however, when trying to assess provenance. The provenance of a Western medieval liturgical book, even when it has not been broken apart, often has to be coaxed from the book in question by considering carefully its style of textual and musical scripts and its liturgical content. Scholars will assess liturgical content both broadly and narrowly, considering the saints celebrated and the large-scale organization of the book, which can lead to successful attributions of provenance when the place of origin is not identified explicitly. While it is possible to identify text and musical script style in manuscript fragments in much the same way as one would with an intact book, the study of liturgical content must be on a much more microscopic level and may or may not give enough information to contribute to knowledge of the fragment's original provenance because of the brevity of the material. Working closely with fragments, however, even if only a single leaf, can sometimes provide enough information to place it generally according to time and place. Today I'm going to talk about two manuscript fragments that provide enough clues in one instance to confirm the regional origins of the fragment, and in the other to suggest a very specific provenance. The Hochschul- und Landesbibliothek Rhein-Main in Wiesbaden in Germany has recently photographed two manuscript fragments with musical notation. The detached upper and lower paste downs from the 15th or 16th century binding of the 12th century Riesencodex, the most substantial collection of the works of Hildegard of Bingen. The question of the provenance of these fragments is of particular importance for two reasons. First, from my assessment of them, they appear to be from no later than the 12th century, and so from Hildegard's lifetime or just before. And second, there are no known extant liturgical books from Hildegard's monastic foundation at Rupertsberg, so a discovery of fragments of a liturgical book from there would be significant for musicologists and liturgists in understanding the liturgical environment in which Hildegard lived and worked. From what I have assessed of the fragments, it does not appear, unfortunately, that either came from Rupertsberg. Both, however, appear to have come from monastic institutions close by and represent local practice from the general time period that Hildegard was active. Today, I will argue that the lower paste down shares liturgical details with other Benedictine monastic houses and has a South Germanic provenance. And I will propose a new provenance for the upper paste down than what was suggested by Gottfried Zedler in 1931, and provide further evidence to confirm the proposed location of the rebinding of the Riesencodex at Johannesberg in the late 15th or early 16th century. Both fragments provide provenance information through details of the musical notation and liturgical content, even though they are dirty and damaged with faded rubrics, texts, and musical notation. When attached to the Riesencodex, the lower paste down had the recto side of the fragment in view, which, as we might expect, is less damaged than the verso side that was pasted down. The upper paste down is a bifolium that was opened up, which we can see clearly from the placement of the holes from the bosses. For this one, the verso side of the half folio with musical notation was visible, and again much less damaged than the pasted down side. I will focus first on the lower paste down. In immediate terms, I can say that the musical notation is in a 12th century Germanic style, but could be a little earlier or a little later. It uses Germanic neumes on a 4-line staff with colored lines to associate with C and F clefs. If we compare this fragment with the musical notation used for Hildegard's chants in the body of the Riesencodex, which we know is 12th century, we can see how similar they are, comparing, for example, the shapes of the virga, the pes, and the cephalicus. To identify provenance from liturgical cues in a manuscript fragment, we need to know whether or not this is music for the Mass or the office, whether it was intended for monastic or cathedral use, and which specific liturgical occasions are discernible from the chants. Despite the challenges of faded ink, grime, and damage, and the missing feast day rubric, I was able to identify the liturgical content and compile a complete inventory on the Cantus database. Here is the inventory, the short form of the inventory for the recto side, and here is the verso side. The inventory identifies the fragment as coming from an antiphonal. In other words, it is music and texts for the office, not for the Mass. Its liturgical content begins partway through Passion Sunday, which is the 5th Sunday of Lent and 2 weeks before Easter, and it includes the weekday liturgy for Passion Week up to the first 2 chants for Palm Sunday. One of the rubrics on the recto side of the fragment tells us somewhat cryptically but conclusively that the liturgy is for monastic use. The rubric Super Cantica, as you see here in the slide, indicates that the antiphon just below the rubric Ego Gloriam is meant to be sung with a canticle, and canticles are used in the office, not in the Mass. This particular canticle appears at the beginning of the third nocturne in Matins, the first liturgical hour of the day. In monastic use, but not in secular use, canticles rather than psalms are sung in the third nocturne, so the fragment definitely comes from an antiphonal used in a monastic setting. Two other musical liturgical elements really fix the Southern Germanic provenance, that is, differentiae usage and the group of chants listed for Feria 2 of Passion Week. Differentiae are found with antiphons, which are one of the main musical genres found in the office liturgy. Antiphons are sung immediately before the intoning of a psalm or a canticle, and then are sung again after the recitation is complete. Included with every antiphon is a differentia, a small musical formula that indicates to the cantor or singer which mode the antiphon is in and which psalm tone and psalm tone ending, or canticle and canticle ending, should be used with that particular antiphon. In this manuscript fragment, the differentiae are identified with both the musical formula as well as with tonary letters. The significance of the presence of tonary letters for the identification of regional provenance cannot be overstated, because they appear only in Southern Germanic sources, such as the Gottschalk antiphonary from Lambach, Austria, or this antiphoner from the Abbey of St. Gall in Switzerland, close to Lake Constance, or this manuscript held today in Karlsruhe, Germany, but originally from the Abbey of Zwiefalten, just north of St. Gall. Given that Passion Sunday and Passion Week are standard feasts in the liturgical calendar, unlike a feast day for a local saint, I was not optimistic that I would find anything particular in the liturgical content that would help identify the provenance. Passion Sunday and Passion Week occur in virtually every antiphonal that includes the feasts from Advent to Easter. The Cantus Index site, a sister site to the Cantus database, offers, however, a feast analysis tool that allows you to rank similarity in content between all the instances of a particular feast across the sources cataloged in 5 databases. Searching with this tool for feasts similar to Passion Sunday, as it stands in the lower paste-down fragment, 16 of the 98 that included Passion Sunday were found to be 90% or more similar. By comparing those 16 manually, I found that 8 of the 16 were not only similar liturgically for Passion Sunday, but also for the ferial days of Passion Week and the first 2 chants of Palm Sunday. Across these 8 sources, there are only 2 differences in the liturgy as set out. First, the placement and choice of versicles varies between the sources, but this difference is not very significant. Versicles are the short formulaic responses that appear frequently in liturgical services even today, things like "May God be with you" and also "with you," and are not always included in manuscripts, probably because everyone knew them and knew when to use them. The second difference between these 8 manuscripts is more interesting. All of them draw on the same 6 antiphons for Feria 2, but include them in different orderings. However, even with different orderings, the antiphon Noli te abjurare is the first chant of the 6 antiphons every time. More significant is that if we search the Cantus database and all of the associated databases linked through Cantus Index for the antiphon Noli te abjurare, we discover that this one chant that always appears as the first antiphon for Feria 2 is a very rare chant. It occurs only in these 8 sources, including the Riesencodex lower paste-down, which strongly suggests a connection between the monastic houses that use this particular antiphon. And all of these monastic houses are in southern Germanic locations, with a couple extending to Prague. The combination of the use of tonary letters, the shared Feria 2 antiphons, and particularly the rare chant Noli te abjurare, provides unequivocally a Southern Germanic provenance for the Riesencodex lower paste-down. Finally, there is one other curious aspect of the lower paste-down that may suggest a local scribal approach to the copying of liturgical manuscripts and a connection with Hildegard's Rupertsberg Monastery. This manuscript fragment has a distinctive height to width ratio that seems unusual compared to other chant manuscripts that I have seen, and has similar dimensions to the folio in the Riesencodex. Not only are the dimensions similar, but also both the Fragment and the Riesencodex music folios have a large number of staves per page, with, in the Fragment, 26 staves on the recto side and 25 on the verso, and in the Riesencodex, 18 staves per side and 2 columns. While I do not have any large-scale data yet about dimensions of liturgical manuscripts and numbers of staves per page, these strike me as unusual and may suggest a local copying practice, and certainly something to investigate further. The upper paste down is much more damaged on its pasted side than the lower paste down, so working out the liturgical content and other elements on the bifolium was far more challenging, but not impossible. Features of the fragment strongly point to a particular location for its provenance, and by extension for the provenance of the lower paste down and the 15th or 16th century binding, since the paste downs would have been introduced with the rebinding. The original leaf was folded to create a bifolium. One of the folios has music and text on the front and back, while the other has a number of elements unrelated to each other that I will talk about later, including a 3-line inscription in Middle High German, a Latin colophon, a Kyrie with very rough-looking neumes, a Gloria Patri, as well as the group of incipits for a Mass for Peace, identified this week by Lucia Dank. The recto side of the liturgical folio begins partway through a chant, which we know because there is no large capital at the beginning of the text block. The chant includes many subsections indicated by the smaller colored letters at the beginning of each line, which suggests either a hymn or a sequence. Although the text is very faded, because of the chant that follows, I was able to identify this one as the end of Humile Prêché, a refrain hymn used in processions. And you can see the text here and how the first letter lines up with the first line of, with every line of the hymn. The large A in the middle of the left-hand side of the fragment begins another popular hymn, often called a versus, Ardua Spes Mundi, written by the poet Ratpert at St. Gall in the 9th century. Ardua Spes Mundi was used in processionals and is associated with Rogation Tuesday, which occurs 2 days before Ascension. The hymn continues on the verso side, which is much more legible, and has a second section with a new repeating melody that begins with the large O at the beginning of the third line. The layout on this side is distinctive in that it begins with the full horizontal lines of script and music that were on the previous side, but at line 4 it divides into 2 columns, and then about halfway down the page, the second column divides again into 2 columns. The next and final chant is a multi-part litany that begins with the antiphon Aufer a nobis, 4 lines from the bottom on the left. A subsection of the litany, a refrain, Exaudi, 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 follows, and then we jump up to the top of the second column for the first invocation to Mary, Sancta Maria ora pro nobis. After the Marian invocation, Aufer a nobis is repeated, as the incipit indicates, followed by another subsection, Miserere, Miserere, Miserere. The rest of the litany consists of alternations between the Exaudi refrain, again indicated through incipit only, with invocations to particular saints, Sancta Michael, ora pro nobis, Sancta Johannes, ora pro nobis, and so on, down the column and up to the top of the next column. The final invocation concludes at the bottom of the right-hand column with a petition to all saints to pray for us, Omnes Sancti Orate pro nobis. Taken together, these liturgical items, the 2 hymns and the litany, do not point to any specific time or place that I have yet been able to trace. Both hymns, however, are associated with processions, and litanies are a major feature of processions as well, which suggests that this fragment came from a processional. The size of the book with the folded bifolium would support that designation as well. Guido Dreves, who reproduced the text of Humili Prece and Ardua Spes Mundi in Analecta Hymnica, found both hymns in numerous 10th and 11th century manuscripts, including in a 10th century missal from St. Alban Monastery in Mainz, a missal that also includes Aufer a Nobis. The three do not appear in the same order in this manuscript and our fragment, and there are enough textual and musical variants between the two that it does not appear one was copied from the other. The musical notation in the upper pace down, however, is South German notation, the gentle curving neumes, and the prominent red F line and dry point staves suggests 11th or 12th century. As well, there is one name in the list of saints at the end of the litany that suggests geographical proximity to Rupertsberg. Alban is in all likelihood St. Alban, Bishop of Mainz, not the more famous British St. Alban. The Abbey of St. Alban in Mainz, which produced the 10th century missal I just mentioned, was a leading institution in the Hirsau reform that influenced Hildegard, and it had established a number of filial monasteries in the region. Having St. Alban's name in the litany in the upper pace down provides a strong regional connection. Some of the unstructured content on the other folio of the bifolium offers further clues about provenance. There is a Kyrie with musical notation, not all of it legible. The melody has not yet yielded a match, but we will keep looking. The Gloria Patri underneath can offer us nothing since it was such a common verse and there's no melody to identify it any further. But the incipits below the Gloria Patri include 5 proper Mass chants in the order that are listed in graduals for specific Masses: an introit, gradual, Alleluia, offertory, and communion. Lucia Denk, who just completed her MA in musicology at Dalhousie, identified those specific chant incipits just this week. She found some concordances with chants included in Masses for peace. And yesterday, going on that lead, I located a Missa pro pacem on Dominique Gatte's Medieval Music Manuscripts Online database with these 5 proper chants in a 1225 gradual from the Cistercian Abbey of Salem in southern Germany near Lake Constance. And there is to show that they are the same from the Cantus database. The 3-line inscription in Middle High German localizes the manuscript further. It appears to be a contract between tenant farmers and a monastic foundation, perhaps a first draft corresponding to the way that the rest of the page was treated. What is important in this inscription is that a specific identifiable and regional place is mentioned in one of its phrases, eine Hus und eine Garten zu Eibingen, a house and a garden in Eibingen. Eibingen is a village on the east side of the Rhine that houses one of the convents associated with Hildegard and is directly across the river from her Rupertsberg convent in Bingen. The Latin colophon provides further details about local provenance. Codex Sanctae Mariae Virginis Antiquae Georgii in Biskobisberg. In 1931, Gottfried Zedler used the colophon to suggest the provenance of Kloster Johannesberg, presumably because of the crossed-out Johannes, and because Johannesberg is on Bischofsberg. So that would be up there. Officially now in Geisenheim in the village next to Eibingen. Zedler does not actually explain his identification of Johannesberg as the provenance, and he does not mention the connection to St. Mary and St. George, which after all are the names provided in the colophon. This reference to St. Mary and to St. George in the colophon is puzzling for many reasons. The Codex of St. Mary the Virgin and St. George could mean that the book belonged to a female or male monastic house named after Mary and George, or to a church, a chapel, or even an altar, or perhaps to a book transmitting liturgical feasts and celebration of Saints Mary and George. One possible provenance, although unlikely, is an abbey church in Erfurt for St. Mary and St. George. So there's Bingen and Geisenheim and Johannesberg, and we've got Erfurt up there. But there is no Bischofsberg in Erfurt, and that is specifically mentioned in the colophon as well. Another possible provenance is the Benedictine Bischofsberg Abbey in Fulda, often referred to as Frauenberg. But there is no particular reference to St. Mary and St. George there. More significantly, since the Fulda Abbey Church, now Fulda Cathedral, was the burial place of St. Boniface, it seems inconceivable that the final litany of saints in the upper pace down would not include an appeal to Boniface if the original manuscript was from there. The most likely original provenance of the upper pace down is a women's convent called Georgenklause, which was associated with Johannesberg. Johannesberg was founded in 1090, originally as Bischofsberg, and was a double house of men and women under the rule of St. Alban Monastery in Mainz. This detail is critical since St. Alban is the only Germanic saint named in the list of saints in the litany in the fragment itself. In 1130, the double house became an independent abbey. The nuns apparently originally housed close to the east side of the church, at some later date split off from the monks and moved to the valley, as reported by Theodor Schlieffase in 1866 and Antonius von der Linde in 1877, with their new convent going by the name of Klause or Georgenklause, and today known as Klause St. Georg. The convent was dissolved in 1452 against the wishes of the nuns, and all of their goods were transferred to Johannesberg, which itself closed in 1563. Given the connection between Klause St. Georg and Johannesberg, the St. George of the colophon must be in reference to the women's house, and I think we can safely assign Georgenklause as the earliest provenance for this fragment. But that leaves the reference to Mary still unexplained. One possibility, very speculative, comes from the genre of the book as a processional. Just 3 kilometers away, in 1309, there was a miracle when a blind hunter, Hecker Hen, was healed after praying in the forest to an image of Mary. A church was built on that location in 1313 and became a site of pilgrimage. Could the book have been a small collection used exclusively for processions to and from Marienthal? And hence then the name of the book, the Codex of St. Mary the Virgin and St. George. The style of the notation suggests a much earlier date than 1313, so it doesn't quite work, but I doubt that the colophon, which named St. Mary and Georgenklause, came from when the book was at Georgenklause. That mistaken Johannes of the colophon suggests that it was written by someone at Johannesberg, probably the cantor who would have received the books from Georgenklause when it closed in 1452 and then wrote an inscription on the book saying where it had come from. We know that the binding of the Riesencodex is a 15th or 16th century binding, which fits with the period between Klause St. Georg closing in 1452 and Johannesberg itself closing in 1563. Here is my suggested chronology. Sometime after 1090, the nuns at the double house at the then named Bischofsberg and a filial house of St. Alban in Mainz acquired or made the processional, including the reference to St. Alban. When they moved from the double house to Klause St. Georg, they took the book with them, and the 13th or 14th century German text with reference to Eibingen was written while it was there. In 1452, the processional that included the upper pace-down litany with its reference to the local St. Alban was transferred to Johannesberg along with the other goods of the convent. The colophon was probably written by the cantor at Johannesberg when the book arrived, which would explain the slip of the pen and initial identification of St. John rather than St. George. At some point between 1452 and 1563, when the abbey closed, the scriptorium at Johannesburg bound or rebound the Riesencodex using old books for binding materials, at least one of which was from the women's house. The other book, the antiphonal, from which the lower paste down came, may have come from either Georgenklause or from Johannesburg, and importantly shared liturgical elements with other southern Germanic houses influenced by the Hirsau reform. Although disappointing not to have recovered fragments from Rupertsberg, being able to confirm the location of the binding of the Riesencodex, as well as elements of liturgy from regional institutions and the relationships with other monastic foundations, is a significant contribution to our understanding of liturgical practice in the 11th and 12th century and to the history of the Riesencodex itself. As well, the study of these fragments emphasizes that in the 15th or 16th century, the Riesencodex was considered worthy of binding or rebinding. Moreover, these fragments tell us that specific value was placed on maintaining in that collection Hildegard's own music in out-of-date musical notation, while these other 11th and 12th century musical sources used in the binding were considered dispensable. All of these elements demonstrate just how important the Riesencodex collection still was to the community at Rupertsberg several hundred years after it was first compiled. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Doctors Bain and Lacoste. We now have some time for questions. Question on the inscription you had there was the one that you think is done in the 15th century. Does that look like a 15th century hand? I mean, that's a question I have for the,
Yeah, so I wanted to do this presentation here hoping that there would be people who had a much better grasp of the written textual script. I've spent a lot of time studying musical scripts, but the textual scripts, and especially kind of individual hands of extra things added, I don't know. So I would, if you have thoughts about that, or anyone else, I'd love to hear them.
Perhaps we could bring it up for a second, take a closer look.
Sure.
Yeah, my rough guess was earlier than 15, but it's still a mystery. It's a small part of the argument, to be honest. Yeah.
Well, yeah, but I think it's, I would definitely love to know more about it. So you were thinking about the colophon?
This is the Codex Sancta Maria. Yeah.
Yeah.
I would have trouble seeing that. I mean, I could believe 13th or maybe even 14th, but
okay.
That's just me. Maybe other people have different views. I'm not always the best expert in distinguishing between these. Professor Morant, did you want to weigh in? Is that what you're?
Yeah, if it's possible, it may be easier to do it.
Sure.
Speaking. Yeah, thank you, Debra and Jenmifer, for the presentation and for the analysis. I also analyzed those fragments, those bindings, I think in 2003 or something.
Okay.
And was looked on especially on the Ardua Spes Mundi litany. And I tried to I contacted Peter Stotz, who has written the main dissertation on this piece, and he died recently, but he answered there in an email that he can't find any special, also confirming your impression, that he can't find any special reference to a local usage or something. Even if there is in the litany, in the Saints Litany, there is, as you said, it's very impressive that there is Saint Alban and also Saint Martin, which would point maybe to Mainz, but in Ardua Spes Mundi there is Alban and Martin is not there. So he argued that the redactor of this Ardua Spes Mundi version is expressively suppressing any local reference. He wanted to make a more or less clean version of this Ardua Spes Mundi, which is very strange because it doesn't fit with the saints litany, because this is a local reference, and in the Audus Vis Mundi there's no local reference. So this is very strange. But just to add this, what Peter Stotz wrote in many years ago. And the second thing I would like to add is that we have also found in our fragments a Missa de Pace. I just looked in our findings in a fragment from the Benedictine monastery of Oxenhausen, where this is from around 1100, and it is neumed, exactly those chants which we have for the Missa de Pace. And there is a neumed version. So just to add this to your findings. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Virginia Blanton, he says, I do have a question. Wonderful presentation. I do have a question. I like the suggestion of 1313 Marienthal, but I wonder if it's a much simpler explanation for the reasons for Mary and George. Wonder if there is one. Many female houses were dedicated to Mary, and that may have been an assumption by the cantor.
Yeah, that's a great question, Virginia, and I did think about that. I actually went down a rabbit hole about 6 months ago and spent ages looking at like all the places that combined Mary's name with other names to see if, if that, and it certainly was a very common practice. So that could be the simplest explanation, and much simpler than mine about the procession.
Right.
Yeah, but I like that idea.
Godfried Krunen just adds in that he thinks that this inscription is perhaps earlier than 15th. He'd say first half of 14th century.
Okay. Well, that is really helpful. Thank you.
All right. And now we have a question from Jeremy Llewellyn. It says, thank you so much for this fascinating presentation. Does the larger paste down suggest why the Riesencodex was so Riesig? Was the model primarily liturgical, as the Riesencodex also has her writings?
That's a really good question, Jeremy. And I think for me, one of the really interesting things about the collection of the music in the Riesencodex is that it looks very much like it wasn't initially attached to the rest of the book. So if you look at the first page of the Riesencodex, it is, or of the musical section of the Riesencodex, it is extremely dirty, and so is the last page. My sense has been that the music was circulating or was kept in these two gatherings, and then was added to the end of the Riesencodex, so that it was copied actually separately and kind of used separately. And I think it's an argument actually for it being used very functionally within Rupertsberg. But you make a really good point that, if was it just done like that because the intention was to include it with the Riesencodex, and the rest of it was her writings, and it's 450 folios of writings, so it may have nothing to do with the liturgical model. But that, I think, is one reason why I found it so interesting that the paste down did have that really large size, and so which might suggest that people, it was just what people were doing locally. But I don't know. When I've had it as a plan, in the summer of 2020, I was going to be spending some time in local libraries and archives in that area to look at some other liturgical books and see from that time period if there was anything in the idea that there was some kind of local approach. Could I ask if anyone had an idea then about the dating of the German inscription?
All right.
Just a quick thought. Jennifer, you mentioned versicles as you were going through, and for years people have told me, oh, who cares about the versicles? They're so short. They're sometimes not all notated, and they're not important. And I kind of think that they might be important. And even in a case of a fragment, I've proofread some of these records as we've been getting this ready to go online. And this particular fragment has versicle text completely written out. It has a tiny little bit of a recitation tone, like 4 neumes maybe at the end. And you can tell for sure where the first instance is and where the response would be. And the division is consistently different than the sort of standard versicle division. So the text would be the same length as, say, in the Corpus Antiphonalium Officii standard versicle text, but the division will be shorter first bit, where the cantor would just give 2 words or 3 words, and then the response is longer, where the division generally is sort of like half and half for that text in many manuscripts. This happens in the Hartker Antiphoner also. And I don't know how widespread it is in all South German sources.
Right.
But like, I don't think anybody would pick up a versicle dissertation because who would care? But I think it might actually be important.
Yeah.
Or it would give some clues, right? Like it would be that one extra thing that would just, oh, it must be this because this source and that source are the same usage of the versicle. So if anyone has a student who needs a side project, I don't know if a department would authorize a dissertation on that, but here's an idea.
Thanks. That's great. I'll take a look at that.
Well, we still have time for a quick question or an observation on the German script from somebody in the audience. In the meantime, I'll ask a quick question to Debra about their coming plans for the DACT. And that's, you mentioned, so you have this social media campaign that you're launching now to encourage people to bring in or to discover fragments, shall we say, that are in the public domain and hanging on walls and such. We love those in Fragmentarium too. So concretely, has this begun? And,
it has begun.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we've received about 20 and that have the inventories have already been done in the Cantus database, and some of them I think have already been uploaded to Fragmentarium as well. So it's underway, and Anna does this Fragment Friday hashtag and posts fragments. So yeah, she and there are several other people who've contacted her. There's sort of things that are in process as well. So
follow us on Twitter, and you can get all those little hashtag Fragment Friday bits. And then she hooks in Lisa Fagan Davis and other sort of fragment people. And so you can get all sorts of fragment feeds in your Twitter. It'll get rid of all the news and all the world events, and it'll just fill up all the top will be all about fragments and manuscripts.
Indeed. DACT fragments, I believe, is the hashtag, the handle.
I think it's DACT
F.
F. Yeah.
DACT, yeah.
So be sure to follow them as well.
And if you have a fragment, or you know of one, it's one in your library that you walk by, or you have a friend who has one, if they could take a photo of it and then contact us, and if they'd be willing to have that photo posted on Fragmentarium, and then we can index in the Cantus database, it'd be great just to have these private ones up online somewhere. And we might, a lot of the Auto Ege fragments have been matched through processes like these, like you find out where some of them are, and there's 50 of them in this library archive, and then there's another bunch over here, and then my aunt has one. That sort of thing can really help to just kind of piece them together virtually. So basically spread the word to everybody you know.
Right. And I'll underscore, don't assume that fragment hanging on the wall in the library has actually been assigned a catalog and shelf mark in the library. We hear cases like that all the time, that someone just sort of sees it and nobody remembers this thing from 40 years ago. It's been on the wall the whole time. So you can make manuscript discoveries just by looking at the walls. So thank you again for a very enlightening presentation. It was a lot of fun. Fragmentarium video conference will be on Friday, June 18th, 2021. When Dr. Godfried Kroenen of the Flemish Heritage Libraries will speak on late medieval bookbinding, paper fragments, and the Medieval Manuscripts in Flemish Collections project. I hope to see you all there. Thanks again, and thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you.